Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Oxford University Press, making the transition to University Psychology 2021 and beyond. I'll be facilitating the session today. My name is Martha Bales. I'm commissioning editor for HE Psychology at Oxford University Press, and I'm joined today by some of my HE Psychology authors. So welcome to you all, and really, I'm just going to say a huge thank you all for coming along today. I'm sure it's going to be a really exciting and useful discussion, and I'm just going to introduce you all. So we have Victoria Bourne, who is Professor Teaching Focused at Royal Holloway, University of London, where she is Director of Teaching and Learning in the Department of Psychology. She's a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. We're also joined by Alana James, who is Associate Professor in the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading, and winner of the inaugural HE Psychology Teacher of the Year Award run by OUP and the DART-P section of the British Psychological Society. She's a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Matt Jarvis is a leading exponent of psychology education from GCSE to postgraduate level. Matt is a freelance author and trainer and currently works as a learning technology and innovation manager for NACRO, a major social justice and education charity. And finally, we're joined by Vanessa Parson, who is senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Sunderland, named University of the Year for Social Inclusion by the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide 2021. She is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So welcome, everybody. So today we're here to talk about this transition to higher education, particularly in a 2021 context. We all know that we've had some particularly unique challenges last year and in the coming year. And so today we're going to take a look at two broad themes when we talk about the transition to HE psychology. The first one is that we're going to take a look at moving on from pre-tertiary study and look at some key skills differences. And then we're going to look at beginning to think more like a psychologist, so setting students up for success by getting them to that stage. We'll be sharing some wisdom, some best practice, ideas, tips, and then at about past, we'll be inviting questions. So please submit them in the chat, and then they'll come to me and I'll direct them to our panel. So that's the kind of housekeeping. So I think the best thing to do is to kick off and make a start. So when we think about moving on from pre-degree study and key skills differences, perhaps the obvious place is to think that, of course, students will be building on what they've done in their pre-tertiary study, but that there are some differences that they need to be aware of and that need to be addressed. Perhaps we might talk about those differences, particularly with that focus on skills differences. And Matt, perhaps you can kick things off by talking about what it really means to be an independent learner when you get to university.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. I think one of the things I've discovered when I've sort of been working around the transition for quite a number of years now is that people in schools don't necessarily have a good idea of what happens to their students at university, and people in the university sector don't necessarily have a good idea of what's happened in the school sector. So I think there's often some surprise in HE how independent study is not a well-developed skill. There are some quite well-developed skills that come from the school sector, but independent study is not really one of them as a rule. And the reason for that is it's nothing to do with sort of quality of teaching or knowledge of the A-level teachers, but there are factors within the A-level system, A-level in particular, that mitigate against students developing really good independent skills. So, for example, if as an A-level student you use a different term or a different example from what's in the main A-level textbooks, you risk examiners not being familiar with it and not marking it right. So that really discourages students at A-level from studying independently. And it's really interesting, having sort of studied this for years. My own daughter is now studying psychology A-level, and she's exactly the same. I'm trying to get her to read around the subject, and she, in a sense, is quite rightly saying to me, but what if they don't know that example? If I write it in my answer, it may not get marked. And she's right. So I think the transition process, it starts in the schools and colleges rather than in the universities. but there are things that both sectors can do working together. One of the things I used to do when I taught A-level was I gave up on the assignment itself. Good preparation, actually deliberately focusing on independent study as a way of preparing students for that. And I think this is an area where there can be some really meaningful collaboration. Schools and colleges will really welcome people from HE to go in and actually work with them to develop those skills outside the A-level course. So.
Great, and I think actually that's something, Victoria, that your institution has been doing for a number of years, that you have an event where you reach out to schools. And sort of how, what would you say to teachers and students preparing to come to university this year about how they can go about fostering that sense of independence in their study?
I think there is certainly stuff that we can be talking to the A-level students and teachers about, but I think there's also more that we could be doing within the HE side of things as well. I think sometimes, we do a lecture on independent learning and then expect the students to kind of do it. And I think there's almost a bit more of a weaning process as they go through first year, sort of developing that independence. And I think a lot of it is around that confidence to be independent. And I think often the first years want to know what's the right answer when they're working on essays and assignments, and actually giving them the confidence that there isn't necessarily a single correct answer anymore. And I think that's one way that the A-level can differ very much from the degree. That in the A-level, I think they're looking at slightly more specific things, whereas when you get to degree level, there's maybe a bit more flexibility and openness around how to approach assessments and that kind of thing. So I think to some extent, it's quite a linear thing, working through the A-level and into the degree and trying to get that somehow building some continuity rather than it just being a step change, I think would be a really powerful thing. And I think that's through sort of building relationships with schools and working with A-level teachers, again, to get that understanding, exactly like Matt said. I think kind of us having a better understanding of what happens in A-levels and then the A-level teachers having a better understanding of what we're looking for in HE would help to smooth that transition a lot. And I think that's something that's definitely we've been trying to work towards, but I think there's still more we can be doing to build that.
And actually, listening to you talk, it strikes me that one of the things that might come up for students is what we mean when we say independent learning, and how we might define that. I know, Vanessa, this is something we've talked about before, and what that means. What does it mean? What is the set of skills that is independent learning?
I think it's very much kind of going out and finding information for yourself and not expecting to be spoon-fed. I think, we all of us we know that there is very much a teaching to the test effectively at A-level and pre-university. And obviously we don't do that, as Victoria said, there's no correct answers. That if you find another example, fantastic, bring it into your argument or your essay or any assignment you're doing. But, learning to go out and find that information yourself and realizing that what you get taught in lectures and seminars is the start, not the complete amount of information that you need to know. There's no way we can cover a whole subject within just our lectures. We're giving you the basics, the broad overview, and then it is up to the individual student to go and actually find the rest of the information. Do the reading we suggest, because we all do that. We all give students loads of reading. We direct them to books. We direct them to papers. We say, go have a go at this. If you're stuck, here's some exercises you can do from class. And loads of that, particularly in first year, because I think most universities now do kind of put training wheels on in first year effectively, and then slowly take them off as we move through, so that by third year, you're absolutely independent learning. It's like, yeah, get on with it. And they all know what they're doing. But in first year, obviously, they need that bit of extra support. And it's just a case of going out and finding information and not assuming that what you've learned in class is it, because of course it isn't.
I suppose what we're talking about as well is giving students permission to do it, and saying that actually it's not that you won't be rewarded. If you put something different in your exam than a different example than's been covered in a lecture, that's going to be okay. You've got permission to do it. You've got permission to be curious. It seems like that's quite a big thing, isn't it? A big change.
It is, I think, and there's a lot of, because they're not discouraged from reading around. I think every teacher in the country would love their students to read more, but because they're having to learn a particular set of things and it takes a lot of time, they don't necessarily read around. I think, I don't know about anybody else, but I've seen kind of a decline in students reading for pleasure. And like things like non-fiction books are really interesting. You learn a huge amount of information, but then there's not as many students reading those, for example, or they're reading things online, but they're not really able to kind of understand the difference between what's good, what's bad, because they haven't done that sort of breadth of reading. It's the breadth of reading that kind of really contributes to being able to be an independent learner, because you suddenly realise there's all this information out there, and it's really cool. Learning is really interesting, but teaching to the test is not that interesting. So it kind of takes the joy out of it.
And I think that brings us to quite an interesting point, and again, something that is a real skills emphasis in a different way than it is at A-level. So obviously at A-level, students are encouraged to do some critical evaluation, but it perhaps means something a little bit different at university. But it's a key skill we hear about again and again. So I mean, that reading around and that getting used to a wide variety of sources is going to be really important there as well. And perhaps, Vanessa, again, this is something we've talked about, you and I, before. You might articulate some of the ways that you've encouraged students and given them confidence with their critical thinking skills.
Yeah, so I think one of the problems with critical thinking is actually the word itself. They get completely confused by the fact that it says critical. So they think, oh, that's okay, I need to pull this thing to pieces and say where it's rubbish. And no, that's not even really part of it. They have to, you have to start off from the point where it's published, it's fine. Let's start at that point. So actually, it's critical. Actually, just means thinking about something carefully and in depth. And yes, there are sort of lots of different levels to critical thinking. Obviously, critical analysis can take many different formats. It can get really in depth. But at a very basic level, it's very straightforward. It's like, do the points you're making make sense? Is what other people have written, does it fit with anything else other people have said before? How do these things fit together? Does somebody say something different? That's critical thinking. It's what you're reading, looking at it and going, okay, have I read something like this before? Why has that person said this? It's asking the why. And if you can answer the why question during assignments because you've been thinking about things as you go along, you've automatically got critical thinking in, and then you can build on that and develop those different skills that go with critical thinking.
And actually, that's come up with some work we've been doing, hasn't it, Alana, in terms of you do that at the beginning of your first steps in research, and then you also have to embed it in the writing up and thinking about the research that you've encountered. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure, it was interesting. Vanessa saying about people hear the word critical and think that means pulling things apart. And I spend a lot of time encouraging students to also think about strengths of research and strengths of their own research when it comes to writing up. And sometimes you really do have to explicitly encourage students to do that, because they hear critical thinking and they think, right, that means when I write up my research, I get to the discussion, I tell you everything that possibly be wrong about the study that we've just done. And actually, it's about recognizing that we wouldn't have given you a study to do that's terrible. There are going to be good things about that. But it can take a bit of explicit instruction to encourage people to do that. And I was also thinking, as people were talking earlier about this shift to being an independent learner, that in my experience, sometimes students hear a sort of contrast in what they're told when they come to university, because they've heard a lot about how they're going to have to be these very independent learners. And I think school teachers are really great at actually emphasizing that when you go to university, you're going to have to be more independent. And then they come to university and they're told you're now independent learners. But they're also told, oh, you can get support in these different ways. And that can sometimes seem like a contrast, because, well, should they be using the support if they're meant to be independent learning? And I think there's a danger that they can be put off from using all the different forms of support that we have available because they think it's a bad thing, because they think they're not being independent enough. So in my experience, it's really helpful as university teachers to be very explicit. Actually, we want you to be using the support that's there, as well as, yes, go away, do your research, do these extra reading. Not sure about something, or if something's confused you and your classmates don't know and you've tried the textbook or an article and you're still not sure, then absolutely do come and speak to us. Use our, many universities call them office hours, and at my place we now call them student hours, to sort of make it a bit clearer that it's sort of student focused time, and it really is intended for them to come and talk to their lecturer and ask us questions. I think sometimes we have to just be very careful that we do also encourage students to make use of all the fab forms of support that we have out there as well.
I think that's a really good point. And actually, you know, the webinar today is called Transition to HE, and it's a term that in HE we use routinely. And it's that sense of process, it's a sense of journey. You're not expected to be there straight away. And actually, again, it's just making sure students know that, isn't it? And that kind of, again, it's permission. You don't have to be the perfect, complete undergraduate from day one. It's a process and you will get there. But I think that's a really interesting point. And actually, this might be a good point to introduce the next theme, which is getting students, because what we've talked about so far is some of the skills around independent learning, critical thinking, and actually the skill of seeking support, asking for help. But there is a kind of a broader theme, isn't there, underpinning this transition, which is beginning to think like a psychologist. And for each discipline, it's going to be different. But here we're going to be talking about beginning to think like a psychologist. And I think it can seem quite intangible, but actually, first-year courses are really designed to help with that, aren't they? And Victoria, I know that, again, this is something we've talked about before, and I know you give it a lot of thought. I know you will give it a lot of thought. But how are those first-year courses best set up to help students begin to think like psychologists?
I think one of the things, and it kind of feeds a little bit from what we've just been talking about, is the idea that sort of nothing's perfect. And you shouldn't expect perfection from anything. So even a paper published in the best journal can still have issues. It's not going to be perfect. So you can think critically and evaluate published research, and you should also be applying that to your own work as well. And it's fine to do an assignment or a piece of research that isn't perfect. The skill really is in understanding those imperfections and understanding the implications of those imperfections. So I think often students will come into a degree kind of with very set views around what should research be and what is success and what should these things look like. And I think giving them the confidence to turn around and say, well, I did this lab report and this bit of my design wasn't quite right, but that's okay. I think trying to give them that confidence to be able to do that and to take that slightly more nuanced look rather than the approach of I learn this, I create this, and then that's the end product and I'm done. I think that level of confidence and skill building is a really key thing in first year. And now I think you get into a bit of a chicken and egg situation where they need to learn the stuff before they can think critically about the stuff. So I think you really need like little scaffolding steps going through where they build the knowledge and build the critical thinking as they go through that process. And I think that is one of the more difficult, nuanced things to achieve. And that's why I think it's really important to almost take a whole degree approach to some of this training, so that the things that we're teaching them, they get to build on and develop as they work through their degree, and they get this kind of real scaffolded, supportive approach to being critical thinkers. And, good critical thinking is the basis of being a good researcher in the end. And I think if you can get students involved in that kind of like, okay, now you get to critically think about things. Now you get to do the research. Now you get to create psychology. And that's the most exciting bit of the whole thing. It's creating psychology. It's not just learning it, it's creating it and doing it and being it. And I think that's where you can really grab them and try to build those skills.
At this point, I'd love to bring in Matt, but just in case there's anyone able to help technically, we seem to have lost Matt. So I don't know if we can bring him back in. But in the meantime, I think this is a really important point, isn't it? And actually, it strikes me, Alana, you've done a lot of work in the past on peer support, and we're talking about things that lecturers can do. But is there anything you want to add from any of your experience with encouraging peer support and mentoring?
Yes, actually, and this is maybe something particularly useful to think about this year with the pandemic still going on and probably still some extent of blended learning happening in many universities in the next academic year, that we as lecturers might need to think more carefully about how we can explicitly and in a structured way encourage peer support. So, for example, this year we helped set up psychology study groups for our students, so that they could meet online, and linking people that were in similar time zones, for example, or who were on similar modules, that kind of thing. Just because actually it was really hard for people to meet each other and naturally develop the sort of peer support that they normally do. And so many students found that very helpful because it gave them this kind of structured format in which to start meeting with their peers and just sort of sharing that experience of developing those skills and encountering similar problems, but then also teaching each other, because we know that teaching others is a really good way of reinforcing your own learning. And actually that, idea there of applying what you learn in psychology to your own learning is quite interesting. So we encourage students to teach each other because we know from psychology that that is beneficial. But there are other things that we do teach students in many of our courses that they can use and apply to their own development. So that when they're learning in cognitive psychology modules, things that help revision, going back and sort of going over material multiple times to help retrieval, thinking about things in a conceptual way, even things that they learn about, the benefits of exercise for cognition. Actually, it's really interesting to encourage students to start thinking about how they can apply what they're learning in their psychology modules to help themselves, both just in general in life, but also explicitly in their learning. It can make the material suddenly much more relevant to them in their lives, and it also can start them thinking about themselves as being professional psychologists in the making, which is a nice identity for them to start developing, but which is tricky because with psychology they might go on to many different careers. So it's kind of saying, well, there are lots of things that professional psychology careers will share in general, and you can start developing those skills and kind of ways of being now, and that will really help you in your studies. Quite an interesting way of framing, I think, which students.
I think that is, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think actually you've brought us back to something that maybe we do need to touch on a little bit more, which is this point that all of these things and all of these requirements are happening in a kind of slightly atomized setting, and who knows what things will look like in September. But I think the point of today is to imagine that there might be some similar challenges ahead. So I mean, perhaps one of you would like to speak on any of the other particular things that have changed in this setting that you found helpful for either skills communication, or again getting students into that thinking like a psychologist mindset in this more atomized environment. Perhaps actually, Vanessa, this is something again that you wrote a really nice transitions piece for our hub last year, thinking about how we do this in this new environment.
I think a lot of it comes down to kind of embracing the digital side of things, because whatever happens in September, there's still going to be an element of this somewhere along the line. And apart from anything else, universities have been using virtual learning environments for years, and we've basically enhanced our provision that we already had, and we've sort of added lots of bells and whistles this year. But one of the problems kind of that students kind of could surmount previous to this year is if they couldn't get access, they could just turn up and find out, and they'd be in classes and they get the information. Whereas now it's actually vitally important to embrace being part of that community by actually making sure that your access to everything works, so that you don't feel, so you're not missing out on emails, checking email regularly, logging into the VLE regularly, checking what your lecturers have put up, checking any notices, because all of those little things, it sounds like they're day-to-day mundane things, but they help you feel part of a community. And I think that's one thing I think most of us kind of try and work on, is helping our undergraduates feel part of the learning community. And if you're kind of outside of that because you haven't got the technological access, then you are going to feel separated. So kind of making sure you've got that access in place, and if there are problems, sorting it out. Don't go 6 weeks without checking your email, sort of thing, because that's how we're going to communicate with you. So if you want to find out what's going on, embracing the technology, and making sure you've got, this is not quite related to what you're talking about, but make sure you've got technology that is suitable for your course. So, there are many options out there where you actually can't download applications and programs onto a laptop, for example, when actually you're going to need to do that for the vast majority of courses in the country. So there's some very prominent ones that are being marketed, which are no use whatsoever because you can't download applications onto them. And actually that puts students at a disadvantage. So it's sort of checking what you need for your course, talking to your lecturers, and realizing that, we're not very scary people. We're all very normal. Some of us are a little madder than others. And, we're nice to talk to. We want to help you through. Our goal is to help get you through your degree successfully. And if we can help you do that, then we will. If we need to listen to you for 10 minutes, that's fine. If we need to direct you to somewhere else, that's fine. But don't sit around and kind of not ask things. Always ask questions, always communicate with staff, with each other, making sure that communication's in place, because it will help you feel part of the community.
And that's great, Matt. I'm sorry, I don't quite know how this. Lovely to have you back. And actually, you've joined us at a really interesting part of the discussion where we're talking about the challenges we've been discussing around skills and beginning to think like a psychologist, but in the particular context of this more atomized way of studying and being. I don't know if you, particularly from the work that you've been doing, have any insights on how we manage this transition, particularly in a digital context.
Ooh.
I appreciate I've put you right on the spot.
You
You just
really
rejoined.
Okay, so speaking as the person who couldn't even get on the call, I might not be the one to I think that some of the changes actually that are happening in schools and colleges in the way they do technology may mitigate in our favour, and some may go against. Because on one hand, schools and colleges have embraced technology properly now, in the sense that all students and all staff are using technology. The only thing I'd say is what might be more problematic is there's been a real shift in line with government policy towards using office-based platforms rather than VLE-based platforms over the last year. And that's kind of in line with the need for live remote teaching. So students are much less, are going to be now less familiar with VLE technology than they would have been in the past. There's a risk that could actually make it harder now.
So that's something that's really coming across. Obviously, we sort of started with some fairly academic concerns, but actually one of the big things is the practical issues around software, hardware, and all of these things. And I suppose the takeaway in a way is that we don't take it for granted that students will know a particular setup, a particular institution. It seems to be quite important. Vanessa.
Yeah, so like there's this idea that there are digital natives, which was a term bandied around a few years ago because people thought it was a really useful term. It's not at all. It's basically meaningless. It doesn't tell you anything about the generation at all. It tells you what people think about that, but that's a stereotype, and that's, as we all know, stereotypes are basically rubbish. So, you know, it's not assuming that students come in just because they're young something doesn't mean that they know how to use all the technology. There are always inductions set on for how to use that technology. So, it's, you know, as long as students take up those initiatives and ask if they have questions and ask if they can't access things, then things will work out really neatly, because ultimately VLEs are very straightforward to use. It's a novel technology for the vast majority of people, including students who've not come through the current system, who are mature students, for example. They may well not have a great deal of technical skills because they simply haven't done it for ages. Or they could be technological whiz-kids. And if you have peers who are struggling and you're able to do it, you know, students can then help each other, and again, helps them form those bonds, form that sense of community. But going back to the VLE, some of the cloud-based software packages sometimes get integrated into the VLE. So we've got that at Sunderland. And actually that has been really beneficial this year. It's really worked well. The students have lost a lot less work, which is nice. So.
All right. Okay. So we've covered quite a lot of ground there, and I wonder if it's time to take a look at the questions. So we've talked about some practical tips, and we've talked about some more kind of nebulous concepts. But if I dive into the questions, just bear with me while I while I wrestle with a new platform. So let's see what's come through. Okay. So we've got one question come through, which I think is actually a really nice one. And open to all of you. What are your top 3 tips or pieces of advice for psychology A-level students as they come in this year? If you could distill them into 3 things.
Shall I start?
Yeah, please do. Please
go
do.
back to the independent learning thing. Treat reading your A-level textbook as the minimum rather than an aspiration. Yeah, that should be the minimum level of reading. Whereas I think a lot of A-level students think if that's something to work towards, reading that one book. Yeah, once you get to university, it's going to be lots of books and lots of other things.
Any more for any more?
Yeah, it's one from me. I think particularly those who've done A-level psychology, and having taught it myself in the past, don't assume what's written in those textbooks is the most up-to-date version of events. There's a lot going on in psychology, and books are several years out of date when it comes to, you know, the latest research. You're going to be taught by lecturers who are prominent in their fields, who are doing research alongside their teaching. So you are almost certainly going to be getting up-to-date information. And you know what? It might clash with what you've read in the textbooks.
Yeah.
And actually, that sort of loops back to a point about sort of reading beyond the textbook and how well students are set up to do that. And I know we're in the questions phase, but I think that's quite an important one to touch on, and whether people have any tips. I mean, when do you engage students in how to go about reading an article? When do you start that, and how do you start it? Do you just set them going straight away, or do you kind of sort of ease them into story? I mean, you're nodding. So what's your approach? First lecture.
I think the longer you leave it, the more they get worried about it, the more anxious they get about it. I think that it's never too early to introduce them to published articles. I think the trick is to pick the right ones. There are papers out there that are incredibly accessible, very simple methods, very simple statistics. You can give them to a student, an A-level student, and they're accessible. There are other papers that if you give them to a third-year psychology students, they would find it intimidating. So I don't think it's a case of when do you give it to them. I think it's a case of which are the right ones to be giving and what are the features within papers that we want to be picking out so that we can, again, scaffold that experience. So I get straight in with papers in the very first week of their degree. I don't think it's too early.
Alana. Sorry, Vanessa.
I was just going to say, we give our students quite a lot of our papers as well. Say, right, you know us, ask us questions. If you're not sure, you know exactly who to ask because we wrote it.
Do you find that makes them...
Sorry, Martha.
I was going to say, do you find that makes them more comfortable with critiquing the paper, or
Sometimes, yeah, because they can ask questions. I mean, sometimes they don't feel like they can criticise it or, and critique it properly. But, it makes them more willing to see the positive side of things. So Alana picked up on the fact that they need to see the positives as well as the negatives. And actually giving us our stuff where they kind of feel like they can't really criticise it because we wrote it and then they might be rude to us, which none of us mind anyway, but that's how they feel. It makes them look at the positives. It makes them say, okay, I've got to find a positive here. Actually, this I've heard about before. Did you think, of this? Were you thinking of this when you wrote this? And it makes them look at the more positive angles, which is obviously a good thing.
And to add to that, I think if you're using resources like an first-year undergraduate textbook, think about a resource that is congruent with those kind of principles. So a book that encourages you to read around rather than looks as if it's claiming to have all the answers. I know no one would write a book that that level that claim to have all the answers, but not to avoid ones that maybe look like they do, and use something that's explicitly there, encouraging further reading and thinking critically.
Interesting tip for to go back to the question about tips for the students coming in. An interesting tip in picking up on what Matt was saying earlier about what A-level is like versus what university is like, is to encourage students to try different textbooks. And I find this particularly with research methods that if something's quite hard for them to learn, if it's an area they realise they struggle with, it can be really helpful for them to go to the library, either online or in person when that was a real thing, and sort of just pick out books and try them and see what kind of voice and way of explaining speaks to them, or even going on YouTube and looking for instruction videos, if it's kind of doing S things. Try a different range of things that might help them kind of get a concept, as well as using whatever the core texts are set for their course, because obviously that's important. But there is a bit more freedom at university. They can try different things to help them individually.
Yeah, and again, kind of picking
Victoria,
sort of picking up on the top tips thing. Another thing that I think can be really helpful. Bear with me on this one. I'm going somewhere proper, I promise. Almost a psychology book club thing, and to speak to people about psychology. So whether that's based on A-level textbooks, psychology, popular science stuff, simple psychology articles. As soon as you start talking to people about these things, you start questioning and getting into critical thinking and having that kind of a discussion, and move away from that kind of, I absorb it, I learn it, and then I give you something that involves it in an assessment. So I think, if there was a summer psychology book club, I think that would start to build some of those skills and kind of start getting students interested in kind of what bits of psychology really do it for me and really excited, and having that kind of those discussions around what do you think is interesting, how good was this, and having that kind of start getting evaluation in there by stealth.
I think that's what's really fascinating is that that really relates to a question that's just come in, because it's sort of, you're touching on a kind of practical thing about kind of reading and evaluating, but also this question just come in from Janice Brown that says, you've touched a little on community building while engaging remotely, but I wonder if there are any more practical tips on how to do this. Now, obviously, this is what we've talked about, is perhaps a sort of pre-university thing, but perhaps if we just take this question more broadly. So she wonders if there are any more practical tips on how to do this, particularly with large cohorts of new students who are quite reluctant to engage online. I think students are missing opportunities to discuss with each other and consequently emailing their lecturers more.
Can I jump in?
Vanessa? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we started a number of years ago, quite a few years ago now. We set up Facebook groups for individual cohorts, because I think sometimes the university systems, they do feel more formal, regardless of whether we view them as formal or not. The students do. And they sometimes don't feel that they can discuss things when we're either looking around or kind of around all the time and it's in that formal setting. So we set up staff-maintained Facebook groups for individual cohorts. They all go in, like we're administrators, we pass on information, and there's obviously we put things in the VLE as well, there's sort of duplication of information, but it's a space for them to ask questions of each other, and they are really popular. It does help for, not everybody wants to use them, and it's obviously optional. But for those that do, they find it really useful to actually kind of have that space outside of university systems, to be able to chat to each other, because they're informal spaces. So if they want to share memes and have a laugh about a Friday night, then that's fine. But they are still academic spaces. So they do tend to be taken up by, the assignments, who's read what did you think of this lecture? And occasionally you do get the odd bit of critical thinking going on. I don't think they realise they're doing it, but they are. But actually, we've got a journal club as well. It doesn't run all the time, and I think it's been on pause a bit this year. But journal club sort of getting articles together, getting students to come along and have a talk about it. And it goes, the ones that attend absolutely love it. They find it really useful.
As the VLE champion, can I just throw in that you can now, in VLEs, and your IT people at the university may not have advertised this, but you can now have social media style courses that are based around discussions and posting, in the context of a discussion rather than a kind of static searchable area. So I would explore that as well.
Yeah, we've got quite a good, we've got Canvas, so it's, I don't know if we're allowed to say things like that, but Canvas, it's got lots of interactivity and it's got lots of units, and we can set it up in sort of really novel styles depending on how we use it. But it is still a university system, and I think it's that block of, I must talk about formal things here, but sometimes I just want to let off steam. And of course, the letting off steam and chatting to your mates is a massive part of the building of the community. So having that space outside, Facebook is not ideal. However, it's a useful tool.
Yeah.
Is anyone else using these things? Alana?
I was going to add something different, I'm afraid. But picking up on something Vanessa was saying earlier, actually, where you were talking about, Vanessa, about you use your own research articles and connect material. And I think one part maybe of helping develop this learning community is about showing students that we are people and we are approachable and just real people, and it's not that sort of big divide that they might expect, where we are kind of authority figures and they don't come near us. And there's different ways that we can do that. So for example, student staff events, and we really thought about this year because it's quite challenging, because we don't have that much time, so we can't put loads of time into developing lots of things. So we were doing things like use the charity online escape rooms and set it up so that we could put students into small groups, which was quite popular for our first years because they were still looking to kind of meet people, and it got them into kind of a little group scenario and they could meet each other. But we also had a staff team having a go at the escape room at the same time. So they were kind of competing against the head of school, so that was quite fun. I think students won, which was excellent. So little things like that kind of just make them realise that you are a person and it's okay to kind of just chat to you as well, can be quite helpful. Another structured ways that we can help students meet each other can be really helpful. For example, I was just thinking Welcome Week, we do sessions to help mature students make connections, and normally we do that for commuting students as well, specifically within their programs, because just recognise that some groups might find it harder to find kind of people that they connect with, to those communities. So I think it is worth us trying to do some structured things to help do that, because actually it's really challenging sometimes for them to do it organically in the way that we might expect would just happen. So yeah, just taking some time to kind of think through what we can do to support this can be good.
And sort of following on from that, sorry, Vanessa, please do.
No, I was going to jump in with something about induction week, because actually it links back with kind of getting them to think like psychologists. So one of the things we do in the induction period is to run little mini experiments. I like some classic things in psychology, and get them doing random stuff in little groups. So getting them to go around and actually experience little psychology experiments, you know, for like 15, 20 minutes at a time. And they get to talk to each other. They get to kind of learn about psychology as real. It's not just in a textbook. So those tend to work really well.
Okay, and actually there is a question that sort of, I think, relates to this somehow, because obviously when you're doing these things online, they depend on a certain amount of engagement, don't they? And one of the questions we've got is how do you build confidence to interact if you're met with a kind of wall of silent black tiles on Zoom or whichever format you're using? How do you get over that? What's worked for you?
Oh wow.
Victoria.
I think one of the things that has helped the most over the past year with that is having something prepared in advance that the students can also contribute to in advance that we then talk to. So I've been giving mine little online quizzes in advance so that they can check their learning, but also then it gives me something to talk about, so that it's not just silence, so that I can say, okay, so we did this question and here's your answers, and this is why some people might have misunderstood it, and going through it, and then that can trigger the questions. I think it's difficult when you go into something just going, okay, I'm here, what do you want from me? But having that kind of mini task in advance, it forces them to engage in advance. It forces them to be more active and proactive within that learning environment, and it also gives you something to talk about. And I think once you've kind of got that started, they often then flow. I think it's filling the first sort of 5-10 minutes is the most challenging 5-10 minutes of the whole session. Once you got over that lump, I find it tends to go smoother. So it's creating something that is structured enough but allows you to talk freely, and that worked quite well, particularly with sort of more statsy factual side of things.
It works with other topics as well. So kind of having that structure to, so like a lot of what I've done this year has obviously been redesigned in the context of learning in this environment. But I started them off slow. So I've never kind of said you have to have your camera on. It's lovely if you do, but if you don't, that's fine. You know, if you want to talk, that's great. You've got the chat function as well. But we're going to do this, and we're going to do this kind of here. We're going to brainstorm over here, and you know, we're going to, and then sort of slowly build up to the fact that it'd be nice to have a chat about this before we do this brainstorming. And this week we're actually just going to talk, so no pressure, but by the way, let's all have a chat, and giving them the questions in advance and say, I'm going to talk about this is what we're covering. You've had 3 days to think about it, come on, off you go. And sometimes we've had, you know, searching for things on the internet and what have you found, and doing little quizzes in there. I think I looked at aphantasia at one point, and getting them to do the apples test, and kind of that created quite a lot of it was the best discussion I think I've had all year, because they really grasped hold of it. And the second they're interested in something and they've seen some of this stuff in advance, once they've built up that confidence, they are quite happy to talk and then not shut up, which is brilliant. You know, I love it when you kind of have to butt in and go, actually, I've got to ask you another question now. But it does, you know, that is a rare event, and sort of making sure they're building up to the fact that we want you to have these big discussions, kind of inching them in bit by bit. So staggering a little bit and not expecting them to kind of be able to talk in this environment, because it's taken us, you know, ages to get used to it. It's taken me all year to figure out that I'm okay with my face being on screen. So, you know, it's a learning curve for everybody. So it's not expecting the undergrads who've never done this style of learning before to suddenly be okay with it. It's, you know, it's building up their confidence bit by bit.
Absolutely.
And do you find that things like no, please do.
Absolutely, I completely agree with what Victoria and Vanessa were saying about kind of gradually building up students' confidence. And I would just add that it can be helpful to let them know what the rules of engagement are, because this is a new kind of environment for all of us, and it's not especially clear to students. So when are they allowed to put something in the chat box? When are they allowed to a question. Can they put their cameras on? Actually, a lot of these things might be sort of unknown to them, and we might need to make it explicit. And that can be really helpful for students, with learning differences or neurodiverse students who actually just need those kind of rules brought out, and so they understand how then to engage in a way that's going to be useful for everyone.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually about how people use. Obviously, you've got multiple channels when you're on a video call. We've got it here. I'm sort of monitoring multiple inputs, and how you go about using that, and whether that's. It sounds like generally it's actually a really useful thing, particularly for students who perhaps are less comfortable with speaking in a kind of open forum. They could put something in the chat, but that seems like something that generally people find quite useful. Would that be a sort of fair thing to say?
Yeah, having those multiple channels and kind of, if they want to put their camera on and talk, fantastic. Making sure the rules of engagement kind of are clear as well, so they don't just talk over each other. I mean, to be fair, once they start talking, they're pretty good at monitoring that themselves. But make sure you do have that alternative option, and you monitor the alternative options as well. So if they want to put something in the chat box, and they don't want to sort of necessarily share it, making sure that their contribution is verbalized as well, so making them feel that they're part of the conversation.
Use of chat function has been quite a revelation over the past year for me anyway. That seems to be where students feel most comfortable engaging, and I think it's been great in terms of kind of inclusivity, where when you're in the lecture theatre, it's always the same few students who will contribute, and it seems like a lot more students are now contributing, and they feel far more comfortable contributing. They can write it down, check it's okay, make sure that that's what they really want to say, and then they click send. So I think it's actually been really beneficial in terms of broadening the involvement of students simply through having the chat function, and them sort of like putting the love hearts on each other's comments and that kind of thing. I think that's been actually really part of building that online community, because I think it really kind of it validates the students that they're not the only one who's wondering that thing or thinking that thing when the others all start adding it in. And I think you're getting, well, I feel like I'm getting quite different questions coming through on chat than I would do sitting in the lecture theatre. They're often far deeper, more thought through, interesting questions rather than a kind of, can you repeat that? I didn't quite get it. So I think that the chat function actually has been a really interesting insight this year. And it's something that I think is really interesting thinking about as we move forward, what elements from this big experiment of the past year do we want to keep and which elements do we want to drop behind? And I think that use of the chat function is a really interesting one that I think has a lot of potential to increase the inclusivity of the way that we teach and interact with students.
Okay, so with the chat function in mind, I better get through some more of these questions. So I've had one that's got lots of votes. And the last question, by the way, thank you, that was Alistair Smith. That was hopefully generated some really helpful top tips there. So the next question is from Robin Green, and he asks, aside from independent learning, one surprising and uncomfortable aspect that some students find is having to do group work, especially if it counts towards the degree. What great tips are there to reassure them about the importance of group working?
I think one really important thing is making sure that they understand why we want them to do group work. I think group work is so important in terms of skill development and transferable skills and employability skills. And, as academics who do research is not an individual endeavour, it's a group endeavour. So I think one of the things that I know I've been trying to work on far more over the past few years is getting across far more why we're doing group work. And I think if you can get that understanding across, they're a bit more sympathetic towards it. I think also having the right infrastructure in place where, sometimes group work goes wrong, and it will go wrong in the workplace. It will go wrong at times. So having the infrastructure in place so that there's somewhere to go to and someone to go to and an easy way to deal with it, because it can be quite awkward when you're saying this person doesn't contribute or that person dominates. So I think having something in place so that students know it's okay to go to a particular person or there's a particular way of reporting that on makes it far more tangible. So I think those are the two things that I think are quite important with group work.
I think it's quite useful to remind them that we're not just teaching them facts from a subject and what to do with it. You know, a degree comes with a whole batch of transferable skills. You know, they are going to be going on to get jobs that possibly don't exist yet. So we're teaching to the future. We're not teaching to kind of the next 5 minutes. We're teaching the skills as alongside the topic. And actually group work is such an important skill because you're going to have to work with people as when you leave university, as Victoria's saying, whether that's in research, but it could be in any environment. You know, unless you're a hermit in the Outer Hebrides, you're going to be working with people. And even then, if you live in the Outer Hebrides, you're probably going to need to see people at some point and liaise with them, whether it's virtual or online. So learning those skills and learning kind of how to deal with conflict resolution, how to deal with when one person isn't pulling their weight, you know, learning those skills are actually, it's actually a vital part of your degree, as well as the factual side of it and the doing stuff with information.
Yeah. Really.
Any more thoughts on that one, or shall I dive back into the chat? Okay, we've got quite an interesting question here, and I think perhaps this is something that's kind of been on people's minds, particularly this year. I wondered what the panel's thoughts were about the paying student as a consumer, and whether they think this is having an impact on the students' perceptions, expectations associated with being an independent learner. Could this lead to students thinking they should be given more or spoon-fed more because of this?
Quite possibly, but it's an incorrect assumption on their part. We all know that, but the students don't necessarily know that. I think it's the marketisation aspect, and I'm not sure anybody's desperately comfortable with it. You know, ultimately, students are paying for expertise. They're paying for access to learning. They're paying for access to the expertise of their lecturers. They're not paying for a degree. They still have to earn their degree, and it's getting clear that distinction. So, do you know what? You're paying for our time. That's what you're paying for. You're the one who has to then step up to the plate and learn that information.
I'm going to be honest and say something, I don't know what other lecturers will think, people in the chat and the people here. Sometimes I think that the students as consumers narrative can be unhelpful for us as lecturers to think about too much, because it sets up a really unhelpful us versus them kind of dynamic. And I've seen this where, you know, people get, you know, question from a student that's a bit written in a bit, you know, not a very professional way perhaps, and it can kind of start them up thinking, oh, they're just seeing it, you know, because they're a consumer and they're just thinking in this way, rather than kind of stopping to think, well, actually, what is behind the student asking a question that way? Is it because that thing wasn't clear and they're going through a really hard time at the moment and that's why it's come through? So I think we have to be a bit careful that we don't slip into this kind of, well, they're all seeing themselves as consumers, because a lot of them aren't actually. They're not thinking that way at all. And sometimes things that feel a bit negative to us as lecturers, it's not coming from that dialogue, it's coming from other reasons as well.
I completely agree. I think a lot of that dialogue is coming from media. It's not coming from students. I don't tend to see students going, well, I've paid for a degree. They tend to go, I've got a question. They know they've got to work hard, and some of them work brilliantly, and they know they've got to earn their degree. They're intelligent individuals who come to university. And I think, so, you know, Alan's right. Sometimes we can do students a disservice by saying you're treating yourself as a consumer, because they're not. They want to earn their degree. They want to learn stuff.
And I think in some ways what's happened over the past year has kind of shown, in some ways, what it is that we're giving students beyond the kind of education, because, you know, in lots of ways we're still providing the education. What they're missing out on is all the other stuff. And to some extent, that's a large part of what they're paying for, is all the other stuff, because we're still providing, you know, lots of the education, albeit in a very different way, but we're providing education. And I think when they turn around and talk about fee refunds and reductions and that kind of thing, I think it's actually about the non-education side of what they're paying for, rather than the direct education taught side of things. So I think it's really shown in quite an interesting way how broad the university experience is, and how they're not paying for a degree, they're not paying per lecture, they're paying for a whole experience. And that's where I think they have missed out over the past year.
I think there's something as well about where this comes back to the transition again, because I think what we can sometimes attribute to marketization is actually just the difficulty of a transition to a different way of working. So I've had students come back when I used to teach A level and say, oh, miss your lessons, not enjoying this at all. actually, by the third year, they're going to come back and say, actually, he was rubbish. You know that you told me about? That's all wrong, you know. That's exactly how it should be.
I think that's a really interesting set of answers to that question, actually. And that question came from Tom Hopkins, and I hope you found that useful. I thought it was a really interesting set of perspectives. Thank you. I think perhaps to round off the session, let's return to something that I hope is very practical and will provide us a nice set of takeaways to round off. And that is, what kind of things can students usefully be encouraged to do after they finish school or college, but before university begins?
Read some books. Like, honestly, that's my biggest thing. We tend to give students, like, in between stages, we tend to give them like some reading list, and it's not just fiction. You know, if we put fiction on there, some things that are linked to psychology. So Neuromancer, for example, links in with cyber psychology. But you've got not loads of non-fiction stuff, and basically we do a whistle-stop tour around the staff and say, okay, what books would you recommend students read? And then we put it together as a big list and go, oh, fill your boots, you know, go and pick the ones that appeal to you, and just do lots of reading and learn about stuff and get used to learning things for yourself and reading for pleasure, reading to learn stuff, reading to find stuff out, rather than reading for a test. And I think that's a massive step forwards in terms of their ability to just go, right, I need to learn this, I'm going to pick this book up and read it, and just getting that kind of enthusiasm for reading going again.
I think do something that pushes you outside of your comfort zone. I think a lot of what makes you successful at university is pushing yourself and pushing your boundaries and taking some risks. So I think doing stuff that forces you to do that in whatever context it is, and to get a bit more comfortable with pushing yourself to do things that you wouldn't normally do and are outside of your usual safe set of things, I think is a really important experience to have, which then you can apply in an academic context.
Alana, can I turn to you next?
I'm going to give quite a focused answer. I'm thinking about students with disabilities, because one of the things that really worries me is that we often get students who have disabilities, long-term health conditions or mental health conditions, who don't register with the disability service before they arrive. And so they come, and some of them think that they'll carry on getting the same support and adjustments that they had in place at school, not realising that they have to tell us in order for that to be arranged. So any students in that kind of situation, and just really encourage them to kind of have a look at the university webpages, get in touch with the disability service, make sure that they're aware of the support and adjustments that are available, and do the steps that they need to do in order to get that, because it will mean their university experience will just go a lot smoother if support is in place right from the start. Even if they think they might not need it when they first arrive, better to get that support in place as prevention before anything difficult happens.
That's a really important point, actually.
I kind of said that doesn't have to just apply for things that have been already diagnosed. With there's more and more people going through the school and college system without autism, without dyslexia being recognised.
Absolutely. I've got one more thing to add, and that's ask why. Start asking why to everything you read, everything you hear, including everything in the media. Whatever it is, start asking why, because that's going to start your critical thinking off. As soon as you start reading stuff or listening to them, going, why are they saying that? What's going on here? You know, as soon as you start asking questions, you start finding out little bits of information there. That is a really good start for critical thinking. Great.
Well, I think we've got a really great range of tips there for people to go away with and apply. And thank you very much, everyone, today for sharing all your ideas, sharing your wisdom, your best practice, and answering those questions. They were a really excellent group of questions. So thank you to everyone that joined us today for the webinar. I hope you found it useful. Yeah, just sorry, I'm hearing myself now. There's a bit of repeat, a bit of play back, but just a huge thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope you found it useful, and that you'll be able to take away some of these things as you head into the next academic year, and all the very best for the coming academic year. Thank you very much.